these are all, again, very low level, otherwise would not result in criminal charges in most ordinary circumstances. This individual has no criminal record, like Mr. Pawlowski has no, or Pastor Pawlowski has no criminal record, and he's been exposed to all these criminal charges, all stemming from essentially a misapplication of the Rook Order that is now knocked on.
Adam Soos here for Rebel News with an update in the saga of Pastor Artur Pawlowski. I'm joined, of course, by Pastor Artur Pawlowski's legal counsel, Sarah Miller of JSS Barristers, who as always is provided to Pastor Artur Pawlowski at no cost to him, thanks to your donations at saveartur.com. Kind of a litany of wins rolling out on the front, testifying to the fact, one, Pastor Artur Pawlowski has been largely innocent all along, and two, he has exceptional legal counsel. Can you give us an update? First off, I guess remind people, for folks out there who aren't familiar with the story, Pastor Artur Pawlowski has been facing a series of charges, largely stemming from ultimately opening his church, feeding the homeless, attending protests. He secured some serious victories on all these fronts, but he was very much one of the most sort of prosecuted and persecuted men in Canada throughout COVID-19, pretty much for trying to do his job as a pastor. He had a major win in the Court of Appeals on that original contempt of court order, on the Rook Order, and people sort of suspected and we hoped that it would result in a number of other charges being dropped. Give us the good news. Let us know about some of the other charges and some success we've had.
Yeah, so to cut to the chase, the good news is that a criminal contempt charge has been withdrawn now against Artur Pawlowski. The criminal contempt arose last summer following the civil contempt arrest where he was detained for 3 days, and that whole proceeding has now been struck and overturned by the Court of Appeal. In June, he hosted baptism outside in the river for the church members. I believe his daughter was also baptized at that time. And from that, a journalist took a photojournalist took a photo of him and provided it to police. And then police decided that he was in breach of the Rook Order, which at that time had been already amended to strike any of that vague language that Justice Germain had been relying on anyways. But now we know is also whether that language was struck or not just doesn't apply to the Pawlowskis.
So just to confirm there, it was dubious in the first place, and now categorically it never applied in the first place at all.
Yes, exactly. So the Rook Order that was initially issued had some vague language that Alberta Health Services was relying on to say, well, it applies to him and he's in contempt. We've said all along that's not clear. It doesn't apply to him. Court of Appeal has now agreed with us. But that prosecution should have never continued anyways from the very first day it was laid, because what happened was days after the Pawlowskis were first arrested, David and Artur were arrested, Alberta Health Services agreed by consent that order needed to be revised to be more clear. And so now it was only applying to Chris Scott, Glenn Carrot, Whistle Stop, and those acting under their instructions or in concert with them. And this baptism had nothing to do, was not done under Chris Scott's or the others' instructions. He had nothing to do with it. At the time, Artur Pawlowski did not know Chris Scott and was not done in concert with them. Chris Scott wasn't there. He was, wherever he was that day, not at the baptism. So the entire prosecution was faulty from the beginning because the order had been revised and it had never been served on Artur Pawlowski thereafter. But now that we have the Court of Appeal saying this just doesn't apply to the Pawlowskis, you cannot find them in contempt, we finally have the Crown prosecutor agreeing that they will not be successful at trial, and so they've withdrawn that charge as well, the criminal charge.
That's incredible news. The other thing, sort of to emphasize your point there, is Pastor Artur Pawlowski does these baptisms all the time. It's not as though he did one out of the blue. This was just an ongoing normal affair for him. That's incredible news. Obviously, that massive Court of Appeal victory that was absolutely categorical on the Pawlowski front, and quite a strong victory for Chad Williamson of Williamson Law, for Chris Scott as well, a Fight the Fines client. Now, this charge, the dramatic airplane sort of landing arrest, that is the charge we're talking about now that has been thrown away when he came back from the United States. An extremely dramatic arrest. Most of these really dramatic roadside SWAT arrests, these charges have been either squashed or thrown away before court even proceeds, right?
Yes, exactly. So we've had a lot of little smaller matters that have been withdrawn throughout the last 2.5 years. This one was very dramatic. You know, he flies in on a private plane somebody from the United States had provided to him. He lands at the Calgary International Airport. He's arrested on the tarmac. And, you know, granted, you know, there's some, I guess, theater on both sides, perhaps, but certainly it's unnecessary. There's no urgency to this. He's hosted a peaceful baptism service I think it was 2.5 months prior to his arrest. He's not a danger to society. He's not a dangerous offender. You know his address. You know where you can find him. You know his legal counsel. And instead of simply, you know, knocking on his door saying, hey, you know, we have this charge. It's his first criminal charge ever. Yeah. And instead of release, you know, you or I, Adam, if we went and did, you know, got in a gathering, breached something, did something criminal of a low level, you know, non-violent type nature, we'd almost certainly be released on release papers right there in the moment. Yeah. And instead they're showing up at the airport, interrupting airport services, interrupting his ability to properly check in with immigration, detaining him for 8 hours for him to eventually be released on condition of keep the peace. It's completely overblown, fabricated, and now he's faced a criminal charge and criminal liability, the risk of criminal conviction and a criminal record for a year. That he's been under these, since June, technically, since whenever the warrant was issued after June 5th of 2021. So a year and a little bit, year and a month. It's wild. It's overblown. It's unnecessary. You know, if you believe somebody has breached an order in a nonviolent way, this is not the response you take to it. You do not issue a warrant and arrest on the tarmac in an airport.
Finally, for folks out there, I know I struggle to keep track. You've been working on this so closely. I believe there's a critical infrastructure defense charge still sort of looming. Can you maybe touch on that and let us know if there's anything else that still has yet to be resolved?
Yeah, so we currently have 4 matters that are outstanding with Artur Pawlowski. The first one is a number of breach of probation charges that arise from the probation that was imposed by Justice Germain that has now been overturned by the Court of Appeal in entirety. The finding of contempt and the sanction have both been completely overturned and struck by the Court of Appeal. So those probation charges, in my estimation, should not be proceeding. But at present they are. We have not had confirmation that the Crown will withdraw those charges. So we have 4 breach of probation charges for things such as attending protests, failing to wear a mask outside, which he's advised that he has a mask exemption, failing to do his community service hours in that first 30 days. He did eventually catch up and do those community service hours, but there was quite a bit of confusion about not being vaccinated and who would allow you to donate your time to, and supposedly not making a phone call to a probation officer on a certain day, which is very questionable because Artur's records show that he was supposed to call in on February 8th, the day that he was arrested for the Coots, and his probation officer is saying February 7th. So these are all, again, very low level, otherwise would not result in criminal charges in most ordinary circumstances. This individual has no criminal record, like Mr. Pawlowski Pastor Pawlowski has no criminal record, and he's been exposed to all these criminal charges, all stemming from essentially a misapplication of the Rook order that is now knocked on. And we see that with the second outstanding matter, which is Coots. So he goes down to Coots, he expresses some support for what they're doing there. He does a prayer and a dinner service of sorts, and he comes back and he's arrested a week later, again in a very shock and awe, like they have undercover police officers and undercover vehicles monitoring his house, waiting for him to come out, for non-violent offenses. And then when he's put before a judge in a provincial court judge in Lethbridge, that judge cites Justice Germain for her reasons to detain him. He can't listen to court orders. He's not listening to what the court says. He can't, comply with release conditions. Well, it turns out he should have never had a probation. Right. He could comply with court orders that were properly served on him and and that he got legal advice on, but he can't comply with court orders that are improperly served or not served at all and don't apply to him. And so then you've got this knock-on effect for that he's detained for 51 days in total but he should have never been detained at first instance. So that's the second one, the Coots Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. The third one is a Public Health Act ticket from December of 2020. We have already done 3 days of the Crown's case. The Crown expects at least one more day of her case and then a day of legal argument. So we have at least 2 more days left on that, and then probably a third day for closing arguments. So we have 3 more days of trial on what should have been $1,000 ticket, and instead they decided to proceed through a different process and seek up to $100,000. So many times what it should have been at first instance. So we've got that. That's the third one, and then the fourth one is Pastor Pawlowski received a notice in the mail that there was a package available for Canada Post pickup. He went to the Canada Post, which was within a Shoppers Drug Mart. He stood in line without his mask on. The Canada Post refused. A woman didn't even speak to him, just went and removed herself and went into the back room. And he stood in line and waited until a manager came and asked him to leave. And so he's been charged with trespass, not complying with the bylaw to wear a mask, and causing a disturbance under the criminal code. So all very, again, you can see a pattern of behavior by law enforcement and prosecution that they are overcharging, charging aggressively, and pursuing these things aggressively, where, I saw plenty of people in my day-to-day, going to the grocery store, going to Shoppers Drug Mart, doing whatever, that were not wearing masks.
Yeah.
That's, as you may not, right? You may have a medical exemption. You may not feel it's necessary. Now, I'm not saying that means you don't need to comply with the law. The law says you need to wear a mask, subject to exemptions, but it's certainly not the showing up and laying criminal charges and whatever. Bylaw said, if somebody goes into a store or a place and isn't going to wear a mask, the fine is $100, right? That's how we deal with it. City Council has said that's how we should deal with it. Not this shock and awe, charged with criminal charges so that you can get, a hopeful resolution on some other thing that wouldn't have stuck.
So just to go through that quickly, and then we'll wrap up here. The bulk of the really serious stuff, while dubious at best, as we said earlier, seems almost entirely based on a ruling that has been categorically defeated. It seems from an outsider's perspective that the Crown proceeding on any of that is futile, because they're going to look back to the fact that these never applied in the first place. Even if they did apply, it's a questionable case at best. The latter matters, which aren't necessarily directly related, though, the sort of sound consequence, not that we agree with this necessarily, but might be $1,100 in fines. And instead they're launching this rigmarole, which seems like a campaign to make an example out of somebody.
Yes, absolutely. The criminalization of Pastor Pawlowski is unprecedented. And instead of what should have been a few, $1,100 worth of fines, has now created multiple trials scheduled presently at the criminal courts. And if you've been to the criminal courts lately, it is very busy. They have better things to do than deal with these over-criminalization of charges that are faulty.
Well, many people out there are shocked with the massive bonuses that Dina Hinshaw got. Wait till they see how much the government is spending on these lawyers, the judges, all of this to try and make an example of a man. It's ridiculous. Pastor Artur Pawlowski has said it. Our viewers know it. Without you in his corner and without the donations of people at SaveArtur.com, he wouldn't be able to stand up to this giant. And these victories that we're starting to see simply wouldn't be happening. I'm very much hoping, and I think that we're going to have more good news to report over the coming months. Sarah Miller, thank you so much for always being willing to join us, provide an update. I know the folks out there enjoy it very much. And for everyone at home, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you consider still chipping in, because as we know, there's still legal battles ahead at SaveArtur.com. And as always, as I mentioned, thanks so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. Well, it's great to be having more and more great news on the front of the Pastor Artur Pawlowski saga. But as you very well know and you just heard, his legal battles are nearing the end, but certainly far from over. If you want to help and make a tax receipt eligible donation to his legal efforts and keep Sarah Miller and the exceptional team at JSS Barristers working for Pastor Artur Pawlowski, and also get a tax receipt for that donation, go to saveartur.com.